We want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you joining us from around the world. It's early morning for our speaker, Reverend Byron Bland, who is in California, and the sun is already set for our friends listening in from the UK, Ireland, Europe, and Africa. My understanding is there's a pretty terrific storm hitting the island, so we hope you're able to stay safe and that your internet doesn't go down. If you were part of our last webinar with Dr. Minow, we're delighted to have you join us again. And for those of you who are new to this series, you are stepping into a global conversation that's made up of scholars, government officials, and civil society leaders, students, lawyers, peace practitioners, activists, and many others, all interested in trying to understand transitions and social change. By design, we're bringing together people from different parts of the world to talk about social and political issues that plague and puzzle our ability to live well together. These seeds of discontent are not so dissimilar, whether you are in Kiev, Addis, Belfast, or Columbus, Ohio. So thank you for joining us. My name is Terry Murphy, and I'm the Associate Director at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. And this event is part of our Recovering from Violence thematic priority. On the screen with me today is Reverend Byron Bland from the Stanford Center on Conflict and Negotiation, Dr. Duncan Morrow from Ulster University, Carl Smallwood, who is the Executive Director of the Divided Community Project at the Moritz College of Law here at OSU, and Shona Bell, whose work through the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland focuses on paramilitarism and sectarianism. 5 organizations are sponsoring this event with nearly 300 of their affiliates, colleagues, and students registered. This discussion, overcoming deep division, polarization, and distrust, finding our way together into a shared vision for a shared future, clearly matters to many people. So for the next hour, the 5 of us are going to engage in a conversation with Dr. Bland. Duncan, who is a longtime colleague of Byron, will begin, and eventually the rest of us will join in. This will be a largely intuitive process, spurred on by real-time exchange and reflection. Along the way, if you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A function. Dr. Trey Billings, a postdoc at Mershon, will be compiling and sending them along to us. And then around 12:30, we'll shift and we'll open the floor for those questions. I now want to introduce you to Shona Bell. She is a dear friend and colleague, and she will offer a frame for our conversation.
Hello. It is fabulous to be with you today. It's such a strange feeling sitting in Northern Ireland and knowing that we have such a fabulous turnout all the way from Ohio to Belfast and beyond. So thank you very much for making the effort to join us, and we really appreciate it. It is quite stormy here, but I'm hoping that all should be well. My name is Shona Bell, and as Terry has said, I work for the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland. For the last 2 years, in the shadow of COVID-19, which we're all very, very aware of, several of us have been gathering around digital tables to wrestle with really hard questions as to why it's so difficult to move from violence to peace. These conversations have been insightful, and I have to say, sometimes overwhelming. Transitions are so full of complexity, and there's no absolute road to peace. However, there are multiple factors that need to be attended to in order to bring forward the process of peace, and I think many of you will be very aware of that in your own work and in your own space. There were a number of significant themes which emerged during our time together, and in every country represented in the conversations, polarization and the difficulty of sharing were central concerns. So we want to thank the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at Ohio State, the Divided Communities Project, and the University of Ulster for their partnership, and for all the practitioners, policymakers, and academic scholars who've participated in the discussions. It's been very vibrant, and so we have enjoyed that very much. One thing is clear: in many post-conflict contexts, even when a resolution or a strong constitution is in place, we are not necessarily ready to share. Someone once posed me a funny question: what are you willing to share? She said, are you willing to share your history? Are you willing to share your country? Are you willing to share your schools or key institutions? Are you willing to share your street? Are you willing to share your house? And are you willing to share your toothbrush? What are the conditions that you would require that would allow you to enter into an intimate relationship of sharing? Perhaps this is our challenge, to start with ourselves and our own hearts. Increasingly, in a more individualized society, it feels to me that I'm less inclined to share. I'm caught by the pace of life and the need to protect the family unit. However, to operate within a community emerging from conflict, I am absolutely sure, more now than ever, that I need to find ways to connect and build relationships of trust within the community. And that will require my ability to share. We must find ways to share. Our government took a tumble again last week. Many of you will be aware of that, with the resignation of our First Minister. So Stormont once again is in flux. Our context immediately falls into the danger of the deep abyss of binary politics, where sharing and seeking a shared future is a step too far for those intent on winning. This is a painful recognition, but reflects cultural anxiety. Maybe we're still not ready to trust one another. Am I ready to trust? Will we ever be? Will I ever be? I look forward to understanding Byron's opinion on this. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Duncan Morrow from the University of Ulster. He's a Corrymeela community member and a good friend. Duncan is well known for his fundamental political guidance and insight, and Duncan has participated in peace-building conversations both within Northern Ireland and beyond. We're delighted for him to begin his discussion with the Reverend Byron Bland, and we look forward to this conversation ahead. Duncan, thank you.
Thanks, Jonah. Thanks, Terry. Thank you all for coming, and thank OSU for hosting this, because I think these conversations are always worthwhile. This conversation for me personally is a great honor, because I have known Byron now for many years, because he was an active participant in Northern Ireland in trying to encourage us to find ways in the middle of a very, very polarized conflict to have proper conversations. And what I was always very struck by was his insistence on the question of, well, how are we going to move forward, and how are we going to find a shared future, even in the middle of a conflict where most people thought it was defined by what became known as the zero-sum game. Everything I win, I must take off you, and vice versa. And so it was always really interesting to me that somebody came and didn't tell us what to do, but suggested to us ways in which we might begin to think together about how we might edge our way towards something in which we could all have some kind of future. So it's with great pleasure that I have been asked to speak to Byron today. And I suppose, Byron, in your work, when you came to Northern Ireland, what I was personally very taken by was your sense that unless we could create some kind of space for relationships, we would never find a way through our impasse. And in some ways that runs against some of the models of conflict resolution, which try to find the differences in the object in dispute. Whereas what you were saying to us was, no, we have to change the way in which we talk about these things, and new answers will emerge. Is it your conviction that actually relationships make conflict resolution, if you like, possible, rather than conflict resolution makes relationships possible? Or could you explain a wee bit more about that?
Thanks, Duncan. Let me start off by making clear that I'm not going to share my toothbrush with you. That's zero sum. and no, it's an interesting question, and through the course of our work there, we kind of came up with a cute little saying, was that it isn't agreements that make for peaceful relationships, but peaceful relationships make agreements possible. And then the question is, what are peaceful relationships? Your question brings to mind something that happened to me in North Belfast. And I had been meeting together with a group of Republicans and Loyalists, and they had been addressing a situation on a particular corner that was especially explosive. And they had come up with some understandings and agreements to how they were going to handle that. But it was all incredibly interesting to me that when I talked to them individually, both sides began to raise how it is that they thought the other side was going to use this agreement to screw them. They were going to use it as a leverage to get advantage over them. And so it was critically important in our understanding to realize that agreements mask disagreements. And unless you deal with some of those fundamental disagreements that we're moving toward something that we share as a shared future, then even agreements tend to undermine the trust needed to move forward.
Yeah, and I suppose I suppose one of the big questions then is the kind of ethical question that begs it: is a shared future just like an open table, we must talk, that kind of obligation? Or is it trying to say, if we're to get there, we have to have contexts which have some principles behind them, but within which some of that deeper issues, those deeper issues can actually come forward?
Yeah, I think from the beginning, I'd like to say that as I talk about the need to come together and talk and take each other's experience into account and try to reach some accommodations, there are ethical limits to that. And I think that I adopt the ones that Avishai Margalit in a book called Compromise and Rotten Compromise put forth. And that was that we rule out on principle anything that is cruel and humiliating. That's not open for discussion about compromise. Anything below that or above it, however you wish, can be judged on its own merits. But if some kind of arrangement is cruel and humiliating to one of the parties, then it's ruled out completely. That we have to talk some about what constitutes cruelty and humiliation, and it's just not, I don't like it. But it is. But things should be. There are limits to what it is that you can do. I think that key that if I ask the question, what stands in the way, and this was key to our approach at the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation, we tended to look at what prevents or impedes progress, and partly we understood that there were, from outside parties, 500, 600 ways that the parties could make agreements that left them both better off. And yet, in the context of that engagement, those parties couldn't get to those agreements, even though it left them better off. And we asked what stood in the way. And quite often it was psychological or strategic or institutional kind of barriers. But mostly it was relational barriers, that the state of relationships between the parties prevented them moving forward and reaching some kind of accommodation and agreement with one another.
What seemed to me to be very important in preventing it being cruel or inhuman was the fact that what you put forward to us anyway was a series of questions rather than an imperative to get to a certain answer. And that seemed, certainly living in Northern Ireland, being very often, if you like, the victim of conflict resolvers who come and tell you what to do. It was very refreshing for someone to come and say, actually, if we're going to move this conversation on, we need to ask questions. And at the core of that first question that you asked us was the so-called question of a shared future. In other words, what is the future I imagine in which the other is present? And to me, what that broke for me was, I think at that time in Northern Ireland, we were working on the notion of a shared future, something very specific, something which had very firm boundaries and shapes. It was a policy framework, it was a document. But that what you were asking us was, we all have our own notions of a shared future. And if we begin to trade at least some of those things, we can at least begin to identify what it is in other people's worldview intentions that we can't bear, what it is that we can suddenly connect to. And we are shared futures are then part of our conversation. So I suppose I'd like to hear you talk about what the difference is between a shared future and talking about shared futures.
Oftentimes people translate a vision of a shared future into a shared vision of the future. And that applies some agreement about where we're going. And we thought that was too high a bar to present, that the outcome of politics is hopefully some kind of shared notion of where we're moving forward. But the foundation in the beginning of engagement is that I'm offering the other side, in my words, my deeds, the media statements I make, that I'm offering them a place that they can pursue their dreams and aspirations in a way that is bearable to them. It may not be ideal. It may be that they have to grit their teeth to enter that kind of shared future. But it does give them a context in which to move forward. And they say, you know, if this future came about, would I live with it? And if the answer is yes, I wouldn't use violence to overturn it. Then you've got a basis to begin talking about what kind of way we live together into the future. You know, we offered them as questions because the beginning of this began with a conversation between the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation and a group that we had some long-term contact with called Community Dialogue. And we held Hewlett funded us for a 4 or 5 year discussion on what is the relationships between grassroots dialogue and political and social reconciliation. And as part of that engagement, we held a meeting at Stanford between their executives and our researchers. And my notion of that was that we would come together and talk about how can we achieve a reconciliation. And the folks from Community Dialogue said, no, that's not, that you get only the choir if that's the case. The people we want to put in conversation with one another are those that think that reconciliation is not a good idea, that I can't believe that you say the absurd things that you do. And we want to get those people in conversations with each other. And to do that, dialogue has to be open. We may come to the conclusion that reconciliation is possible. We may come to the conclusion that reconciliation is more impossible than we thought. But we have to leave that open. And so we felt the way to leave dialogue open was to ask questions rather than to constrain it to certain kinds of outcomes.
And for me, it also exposes the conversation slightly differently, because instead of me saying, you must do this, it asks me to put forward my own issues. And then to us, in a strange way, together in telling our stories, we expose those parts where we haven't really thought through the place of the other, but also where the other hasn't really thought through where we belong in the future. And it begins for me, not just a one-off conversation, but actually the possibility that through very difficult dialogue about really difficult things, eventually, if we cling on to this framework of questions, we might begin to identify what would be bearable. So for me, it seemed like it created the possibility, at least of movement, not of false reconciliation or false compromise, as you say, but of some kind of movement in a direction.
I think that's right, Duncan. I remember being at a big meeting in Belfast where the parties were supposed to get up and talk about how they were working together. And in fact, one of the parties wouldn't even enter the room until the event started. But in the midst of this conversation, one of the people who were part of Community Dialogue stood up and asked the question of, where am I in your future? And I don't think any of the parties had thought about that question, that they came prepared to talk about why what they wanted was right and just and fair and is the way that we deserve to move forward and all of that sort of stuff, but had given very little thought about where's the place of the other in the future I'm pursuing, and is it there in a way that they might find bearable? And yet that was the key question that had to be addressed if any kind of progress was going to happen. You know, we oftentimes think, I think this is a good example of this is a ceasefire. A ceasefire is made not because they agree about where the future is going to be, but because they disagree about that. That in the case of the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel that took place several decades ago, Hezbollah entered it because they thought that they would be better off in the future. Israel entered it because they thought they would be better off in the future, and Hamas would be worse off. And yet that can't happen. And so they entered that ceasefire expecting different outcomes. And the question is, does that ceasefire give them an area, a moment of calm in which they can work out how they progress in a way that they both have a common destiny that they could live with? I think, let me add one other thing here. I think the notion of a shared future is really a statement that we have a common destiny, that we are a unit of survival. And common destiny, unity of solidarity sometimes means we have a shared past, but it definitely means that we have a shared future, that our destinies are tied together. And that's a big question that the parties in Northern Ireland had to address, whether we share a destiny with these people or we want to be separate. And I think in many, you're seeing that in Canada today, that part of the leaders of the whatever you want to call it, blockade, truck blockade or whatever, they have origins in the separation of the prairie provinces of Canada from the rest of Canada. And they want to cut their links about that. And we don't want to share that destiny with you anymore. And I think we're at a point where that's a question here in the United States as well. Of are we going to share destiny, this destiny in this area called the United States, or are we going to go our separate ways and break that destiny? And I think that's a big question.
And even it might be possible that a shared destiny involves separate spaces for each of us. That is, those things can be talked about. That the shared future involves us agreeing that in certain things we will do them apart.
That's true.
Within your the conversations that we had, there was more than one question. You eventually called it the 4-question framework, and there were 3 other questions which, in a sense, touched on some of the really deep ethical dilemmas that are some of these obstacles you talked about to even beginning to consider that we might have a destiny with somebody else. And so I'd quite like you just briefly to outline the other 3 questions, not necessarily say where they came from at this stage, but just give us some sense of what the other content of that conversation might look like.
We thought of those questions as generative themes, that they were the issues that generated all the specific conflicts and contentions that were taking place in the public arena. And they seem to center on 4 points. And the most fundamental one was the future. What's the future going to be? That in part, I want to go to A, you want to go to point B. Can those things be put together in such a way that we can do that together? And that's the question of a shared future. Do we exist in solidarity with one another to create a future that is mutually bearable to one another? But that also involved a second issue, which is trustworthiness. I mean, you've been shooting at me for 30 years. Now you extend a hand and say, let's move into creating a future. And I wonder why. I mean, what changed? Why is it now you're offering me a hand when previously you were pointing a gun at me? And so the question of are you trustworthy partners has to be demonstrated to one another. And we have to ask ourselves what's involved in that. The other 2 questions, which were really critically important, arose in the context of any negotiated agreement. That any negotiated agreement is going, because it's negotiated, is going to impose losses and injustices on the parties from their perspective. But the fundamental question that has to be answered yes is, are you better off in peace than you were in conflict? And the answer to that question has to be yes. And so the other 2 talk about how do you create a future which is in peace that is better than the one we had in conflict. And it has to do with recognizing that living together, no matter what it is, imposes losses on people. Maybe it's just in terms of aspirations, but we have to live with things that we want that we aren't going to get. And secondly, it involves what you might think of as unfair relationships, that in part the relationships need to be fair or minimally just, or they aren't legitimate. But in many ways, that's a barrier because we disagree about what entitlements we're due, what justice entails. And so the way to move forward seemed to us to be, how do we agree to rectify the most egregious injustices that living together imposes on us? And so I think that those 2 things of how can I accept the losses so I can make the concessions necessary to receive the benefits of peace, and how do we work together to address the injustices that would impose on us immediately, so it becomes ever and ever a less unjust situation.
The that frame of, which exposes what do we actually carry in what we're saying about a shared future. So what is our message to the other? What are the real obstacles to us sitting here? What is it that can't be trusted or needs to become trustworthy or hasn't been trustworthy, and that issue? and also the issue, as you called it, of entitlements, this issue of what has to change socially and economically in order for this to feel even minimally fair and just. Those seem to me to have been persistent issues for us, and really constantly coming back to the table. The one that always has, I think, tripped us up is the issue of loss. In other words, that very much in my experience, some of the models of conflict resolution are very focused on win-win, and win-win's easy to identify, and certainly there needs to be something which people feel this is moving us forward into somewhere better. But it's always struck me that at a relational level, that win isn't cheap. That win comes at a certain price in terms of changing some of the things that I took for granted. But more importantly, almost in this, I think in Northern Ireland, we came to the really more, we are still stuck, I would say, in the more difficult issue, which is we have to bear each other's losses. In other words, we have to make room for people not to be humiliated by moving forward, because very often loss is associated not just with loss as in grief, but as in I have lost something for which I stood for generations. So for example, in our case, I'm not going to get either the pure union with the United Kingdom or the pure Ireland with Ireland. And it's really hard for people to bear if their entire political career has been based on making those two propositions. And somehow or other, the question of how we help each other understand when, paradoxically, and not getting what we wanted, but also manage those losses, has been really complicated emotionally, I think. Almost and part of me says, if you ask that question too soon, people won't enter. What do you think about that?
I think that let me give you an example. If there was in the time in the early aught years in Israel, two proposals put forward after the Second Intifada. One was called the Geneva Accords, and one was called the Sari-Nusseibeh Plan. The Geneva Accords was 50 pages or more. And it was based on basically log rolling, that you give people common things that they can achieve together, and they'll forget about the losses that are entailed in that. And what we found was that people tended to pocket the benefits and then tried to negotiate away the costs. And so they didn't move anywhere. And in addition to that, if you took things like the borders of refugees in particular, it was 7 or 8 pages long, and you could read it in about 50 different ways. And so it left more confusion, since both parties read those provisions in the best possible light for their side. And we thought that the Nusseibeh Plan, which was a page long, it simply made declarations. Jerusalem will be the capital of both states. Refugees will go back to their own particular neighborhoods and communities. I don't think that was exactly it, but in any case, they were very explicit about the losses involved in it. And both sides said, it was interesting, both sides says that Israelis said if the Palestinians are making those statements, they're serious. And the Israeli and the Palestinians said if Israelis are making those statements, they're really serious about this. And so I think acknowledging the other side's losses is really, really critically important for taking them seriously. We recognize this is costing you some things, and we want to make that as bearable as possible, but we're both going to experience that. But I recognize that it's not. Most times what people think is that the agreement imposes all the losses on us and gives them everything. And both sides think that simultaneously. And that's because what they think that the other side is claiming is something that they have no entitlement to. They have no real claim on. So they're just giving up where they should have given up a long time ago. And so therefore there's no losses involved in that. For those people, though, they're real losses. They're painful losses. That I have aspirations which I am, at least in the short term, giving up. And maybe in the long time giving up. But if I'm not giving them up in the long time, I'm certainly constraining the means by which to achieve them.
We have other people who are listening in this conversation. Carl, Terry, Shona. I think it would be quite useful to just try to see if any of you have a question that you'd like to put to Byron, to take the question in a direction which you think would be important to probe.
I defer to you, Carl.
Well, thank you, Terry. Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Byron, and hello, Duncan. And you know, I've listened, and the parallels between the Northern Ireland experience and the United States experience seem to become clearer to me the more often I hear Duncan speak of his experience, and the more often we have conversations with people like you, Byron, who have lived in both experiences. And I guess I wanted to acquaint some of our viewers with you a little bit more and let you address a question that relates to how we shape the future here in the United States. And it's because you grew up as a child of the Civil Rights era in the United States on the Alabama-Georgia border. Your high school class, as I understand it, was the first integrated class to graduate from that high school. And through your life's work here and abroad, you've gotten a chance to see firsthand what injustice looks like. And certainly in the United States, you know, we're around during Jim Crow, separate but equal periods, de facto segregation, now mass incarceration and inequality. And I wonder what process you think would be helpful to create a shared future that includes greater racial justice here in the United States. Can you give us some guidance about how a process could move that conversation forward?
That's a question that's very dear to my heart, Carl. As you said, I did grow up in the heart of the civil rights movement. That the integration of schools, but really technically the desegregation of schools, occurred around me, and I think that there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from that. In the language that King used, and he's very important to me as a person who changed my life. He talked that desegregation was legal. That's something you legally addressed about it. Integration was a moral and spiritual goal, and I think that some of the issues and dissatisfactions and anger that we're experiencing today are a result of the disappointment as we tried to move from what nominally is desegregation, but what maybe even should be called resegregation. There's disappointment that it didn't produce the kind of sense of who we are together as a body that we want. And I'm deeply sensitive, and I share that disappointment. A friend of mine, Floyd Compton's, that I've known for a long time, an African-American pastor here, that we are very close friends, got together and decided that we wanted to begin to look at how could we revive some of the energy and vision of Martin Luther King Jr. And we took his Nobel lecture, not his acceptance speech, but his lecture, and it identified 3 problems that were moral problems facing the United States: racial justice, poverty, and war. And each, at that particular time in 1963 or 64, there was a political agenda that went along with that. And we've lost that. We don't have, couldn't tell you what the political agenda is for that today. But it has to be reconstituted. And so we took each of those goals and turned them into something positive. We took war, and because of our experience in Northern Ireland, turned it into creating peaceful relationships. And then looked at what were the generative themes that created the issues there, which were the 4 questions that Duncan mentioned later. We took racial justice and translated it into creating small communities. And what we discovered was that we didn't actually know what a shared future looked like, that it was a harder problem than we had imagined when we had to do it rather than telling other people how to do it. And we felt that one way of going that was to take the other 3 questions of trustworthiness, loss, acceptance, and injustice, and use them to interrogate what a shared vision might look like. What are the tools? What did it have to contain? What could we use to work toward creating that? And we came up with three that were, I thought, pretty important. One is fostering dignity. The second one was safeguarding livelihoods. And the third one was encouraging respect. The difference, because oftentimes dignity and respect seem to be put together. Dignity is how I think about myself. Respect is how I think about you. And so we thought that those were critically important as we try to put together. Quite often in political campaigns, people will say, oh, we're going to create a jobs program and it's going to give people dignity. And we think it should be presented the other way. We're going to foster dignity. And the way we're going to do it is through a jobs program. We're going to safeguard livelihoods. And the way we're going to do that is in a reformed police, turning a police force into a police service that safeguards the things that we think are important is one example. But also it goes on to all kinds of things that are our livelihood, jobs and other things. And then finally, we're going to encourage respect, which is that I don't have to agree with you, but I have to take your lived experience seriously. There's some basis for what it is that you think. And I have to take that as seriously as I take my own, even though I may draw entirely different conclusions about that. And if I have those tools as foremost in my mind, I have at least some way, some map, some chart for how to go together to create the possibility of a shared future. I should say that, this is no kind of silver bullet stuff. I mean, we may come up with the fact that we can't. No, the real thing is, no, we can't live together. And I think to a certain extent, there's a lot of that going on in the United States. So we've looked at it and said, we're not going to live together. I don't think people have thought about the consequences of that. That I saw in Northern Ireland, it wasn't ever a fair relationship or a good relationship or any of that. I saw what happened when you broke political relationships, and that was terrible. And it is really, really hard to put them back together. So before you engage in these kinds of things which break apart our sense that we share a common destiny, you ought to be really clear about what the costs are.
That's a really important point, and I know you've used the term hostile peace before. We've used that term in conversation, and it's not one that I think is very common in the American lexicon, that we don't discuss it as applying to our situation here in the United States. But certainly the experience in Northern Ireland would indicate that you have to be very careful about what you might unleash.
I think we have a hostile peace here, and I think that's the best description of it. I mean, a hostile peace came apart because we used the common term, which was post-conflict peace building, and we got 4 days of lectures about it wasn't post-conflict anything. This conflict was still raging in Northern Ireland. But what constitutes hostile peace is that both sides think that if the other side got what it really wanted, it would be unbearable. It would be tragedy. And I think that fairly well accurately describes the polarization in the United States today. And so the issue is, it's never the issue. So there's a housing project in Belfast. And the issue is where the doors are and all that. That's got nothing to do with it. It's got to do with how that housing project influences the future. Does it help the other side get what it wants? And I can't fundamentally abide what the other side wants. I once did a workshop where I asked, it was mostly from Africa and a couple people from the Middle East, and I asked them to describe the conflict to each other, and I was going to have them use that to introduce one another. But I didn't do that. I tricked them on that. And I simply said, ask yourself the question, if the other side, in the conflict you have described, if the other side got what it really wanted, what would happen to you? And that's the fundamental question they had to deal with. If that answer came out bad to terrible, you were in real problem. And so I think that's the discussion that we have to deal with of is it possible to move beyond a hostile peace? And I think that's core to what we as a nation face today.
Well, I know Terry or
Yeah,
Shona
maybe-
may have a question. If you want to join.
Now, maybe I can pop in here, Carl, because it fits a little bit with your ongoing conversation. And I'm going to combine two related questions. So when you talk about hostile peace, and so I'm thinking about hostility, it takes me right back to trust.
Mm-hmm.
James Baldwin, who's an essayist, was an essayist here in the United States, said, "I can't believe what you say because I see what you do."
Right.
And so almost by definition, we were talking about trying to foster trust when none exists. And why should we trust those who are not trustable? They're not worthy of our trust. So why in the world would we do that? So that's part one. And then it takes me to this idea of dialogue and coming to the table, something that I've been passionate about for most of my career. In the United States, we have become so polarized that dialogue is now suspect, because for many people, there isn't an interest in talking anymore. There isn't an interest in dialogue because we've been doing it for years. And these folks are saying, we want change. And we're demanding change as a precursor to a talk. All right, we're done with talking. And quite honestly, there's some integrity with that sentiment, but I also think it's problematic. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of the trust, bringing people to the table when there's maybe no reason to come to the table because perhaps the table is actually a foil?
Let me take those in reverse order, Terry, and help me to answer both of these, because there are a lot of things in the two questions that you asked. One of the overlooked parts of negotiation is that you're negotiating to get something that you can't do by yourself. That if you can do it by yourself and you want to do it, just go do it. I mean, I don't have to talk to you about it. I just go do it about this stuff. I mean, it doesn't matter. I should only be negotiating or dialoguing with you because it enables me to do things that I can't do without your aid or assistance or cooperation. And so one of the things is that I would say, we had a conference once in, I think it was Manila, on reconciliation, and people were saying, I'm not for it. And I said, if you can get what you want without involving the other side, just go do it. I mean, there's no reason not to. You shouldn't be talking to them about whether you should do what you can do. You should, if you want it bad enough, go do it, and want to deal with the outcome of that, go do it. About this stuff. But reconciliation, however you want to define it, and we did it as partnerships because we didn't want, it's oftentimes defined in such ways that you don't find them anywhere in families or political things about it. But it has to be working together for a mutually beneficial future. That we do that because I need you. I need you to achieve the things that I want to happen in my life. My goals and aspirations involve your participation and cooperation in those, or at least not your impediments, so you can prevent it. And so that's the context for dialogue, is that I need you to come along about this. The relationships in that begin with what we might call distrust or mistrust, and those are critically important distinctions. A lot of times people think that the problem is mistrust. And you see this in dialogue groups all the time, that if you kind of come together, you get to know one another, obviously there's going to be some common ground that comes together. We're going to understand people's humanity, and we're going to end up singing Kumbaya. I mean, that's just a given in the situation. And there are situations in which, and I define mistrust as not knowing enough to know whether I can trust you or not. And that is a problem sometimes. That wasn't the problem in Northern Ireland. It wasn't the problem that I work with between Israelis and Palestinians. And I don't think that it's the problem in the United States. It's distrust. And I think that what distrust is, the expectation of harm coming from this relationship or encounter. That I know enough to know that if I'm going to be in contact with you and I'm going to be working with you, harm is coming my way. And I think that's the fundamental problem that you have to deal with. And that is only demonstrated, the trust that is needed to dispel distrust is only demonstrated in word and deed. That I have to say something and I have to do something. There was one of the barriers to understanding that we talked about, which was reactive devaluation and false polarization. Those naive realism were the three that were critically important. And I in false polarization, in reactive devaluation, I make an offer, and because I put it on the table, the other side recognizes what's not there, and so that becomes more important. And so, if I just tell you, here it is, I will attribute to you and ascribe to you motives that maybe aren't yours. That you're doing this to get something. You're doing this to some way or another pull the wool over my eyes. It really isn't serious. You're going to take it back or whatever, this kind of stuff. So that it becomes important as I make a gesture to tell you why this gesture now, in all the ways that can be done. Why this gesture now? Why this gesture now? And why this gesture now? And and if I do that, I'm at least telling you what I intend about that, and not let you ascribe to me the worst possible motives and outcomes. And so I think that you can't move forward without both saying what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then doing it. And so I in that sense, I am sympathetic with what Baldwin said.
I am coming in on that. I mean, I think much, I imagine, as some of the issues that are going on in the States, but certainly in Ireland, distrust, anything except distrust, was considered madness, really, except on a personal basis. Mm-hmm. And so it is, and it's still extremely easy to regenerate a crisis of trust, because it is very deep in the expectation of communities, of people, of histories. It's in the narrative, it's in the culture, it's everywhere. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing for me was trustworthiness is the issue here. And that has to be show, not tell. That has to be show, not tell. Tell is of interest, but it could easily be a trick. There has to be a demonstration that something has changed for me to even move onto the ground. So I'm 100% sure about that. And then the third thing, which was certainly important for us, which I'm interested in America, is one of the values even of agreements. And we have a so-called agreement, which isn't really an agreement. It's just the beginning of an agreement. Is something has to be put in place to guarantee it can't just be between us. It's not just a meeting all the time. We're negotiating the framework within which we can get to the next stage of meeting. So there's a third party at this table here. In our case, one of the problems we have was and has been that we relied on some other people outside, of whom America at times was one, to hold us to account to the promises that we made to each other. So we needed a third party who was important, and they've a bit disappeared, to be honest with you, at this stage, which leaves us quite naked with each other again, and we have to go back to the distrust question again and the trustworthiness question again. But I suppose what I am quite interested in is, part of the issue about moving from distrust to mistrust is creating a context where we can probe this. This is why some of these questions, some of these dialogue frameworks, is this distrust or is this mistrust? And some of the things that we're finding out through the engagement conflict is, do they mean it or do they not? And part of that comes from the actual experience of what happens in the room when the questions are asked and when the requirement to talk about trustworthiness comes onto the table.
Duncan, there's a lot in what you talk about, but one thing that stands out to me is that a lot of times people say, I need trust in order to create a shared future. And it's actually the opposite, that a shared future a shared future produces trust. And so that's the reason it's important to talk about a shared future. Why should I trust you I should trust you to pursue your interests? Now, those interests may run fundamentally against me, but I should trust you to do that. Why would you make an agreement that you couldn't live with? So that in some ways you have to deal with the nature of a shared future is that interests are incorporated in one another, that they fit together and they pursue them simultaneously together about that. That's a platform on which you either build trust. That's not trust itself. But unless I believe that there's a future we could live together and I could live with there, why should I trust you? And so it has to be, I can't develop trust apart from that notion of shared future. That is distinct from the question of trustworthiness. And so I have to demonstrate my trust that I got from this in trustworthiness, that I'm a trustworthy partner about this. And we divided that up into three kind of subcategories. One was whether it's open and closed. So the unionists said you signed an agreement about turning over weapons, just do it. And the Republicans said, no, we're talking about entering a process in which that's the outcome. And so is the agreement open and closed, or is it a process that we're doing? In part, every agreement is an open agreement, that it is, I can always say, not today, not tomorrow, I'm through with this. But the sense of what's nailed down and what's not. And so in the process of this creating a future, it is helpful to come to agreements and nail them down at certain points about things. I'm not saying that reaching negotiated agreements is unimportant. It's just to realize that that's an outgrowth of a certain kind of relationship, and that agreement helps solidify and stabilize that relationship. And so we should see them within that kind of context. There are a couple of others, and we've talked about one, which is the agreements that mask disagreement, as in ceasefires. And then there's one about, whether, I have a gun at your head, you have a gun at my head. I have a pretty good idea about who should go first in taking those things down. And so there's a way in which you have to kind of make sure you're committed to follow this thing through, because every step that you take is going to advantage, if it's two parties like in Northern Ireland, it's going to advantage one party more than the other. And there's always the possibility that I say, yeah, we're here now. I kind of like that as a place to stop until we develop more trust. And so there are various kind of eddy currents within that kind of question that have to be addressed. But it isn't that I'm trying to say that you need legislation, you need policy to address the divisions in the United States. That needs to reflect the relationships that come into it. That's all that I'm trying to say.
Byron, could I ask you, you talked about mutual bearability, and it's a term that I would be really interested in understanding your perspective on a little more, and the place that it falls. Where does that fall in terms of trust? Is that what allows you to come into the room in the first place, or is that what you're working towards, or is it the starting point of the resolution? I would really appreciate your thoughts on that.
You said mutual vulnerability?
Bearability.
Bearability. Okay. Yeah, most people want to translate that into I don't like it. I just prefer another outcome. And we mean it in that I have to grit my teeth. That it's hard for me to do this. But if it were to come about, and the main thing is I wouldn't use violence to overturn it. I mean, that's the fundamental thing. That's the dividing line there. If I were to say that this is unacceptable, I can't do it, and I will use violence to overturn this, then it's unbearable. If you say, I won't like it, I don't like it, I will work every day to improve it or move it in the direction that I won't do, but I won't use violence to overturn it. That's politics, and that's constructive. But that's the dividing line, I think, between what's bearable and unbearable about that. And it isn't hard and fast. I mean, that's the judgment everyone has to make about it. But it really involves the question of whether I'm going to use violence or not.
Thank you. It's quite interesting because you can see how it moves as well, then, how that moves, your level of bearability and whether you can bear it moves as well. So it's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really tough call. I mean, it isn't just I don't like it. It really means that this is really, I mean, my dreams and goals and aspirations for who I am and want to be for myself, my community, my family are at risk to the point to where I'll use violence to prevent that from happening.
We had a principle to try to protect us against that one thing, and about the bearability thing, which was called nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, which was that you had to see what the trades were around, and you could have the open conversation about the wins and loses. There's an interesting question in the chat from Ali Amla of Solutions Not Sides, and what he says is, and I assume it's the heat, and if I'm wrong, I apologize. Creating a space to explore developing a win-win solution or roadmap to peace often comes with the accusation of two-sidism or normalization. And so I suppose, coming off my comment, I suppose I'm saying to you, we had two sides, but none of the issues were equal. All of the issues were unequal. So how do you manage that issue of the accusation that dialogue promotes two-sidism? You know, there's one this and it's cut 50-50, rather than it deals with the question at hand about what has to change for this to be bearable.
I think if we're talking about strictly dialogue, okay, then I think you have to say what these aren't are substitute negotiations. I mean, we aren't negotiating win-win solutions when we're having dialogue. We're trying to create understanding and explore whether it's possible to develop solidarity, to create a shared future. And that means basically solidarity with we stand shoulder to shoulder in creating a mutually beneficial future. Negotiations in politics, which what in politics is basically, is about trying to get to something that we share. We agree about this. But fundamental is that we believe there is a realm of futures out there that we could bear together. And then once we believe that, how do we operate within that sphere? And dialogue is really not substitute politics. I mean, one of the things that, I mean, this is kind of an aside, but when we would bring folks either from the Middle East or from Northern Ireland to Stanford, we made really sure that partisans in that group were not part of those discussions, because it really did involve the parties making their own concessions and their own kinds of understandings, where outside groups, all they can do is demonstrate their commitment to one side or another. I mean, they can't make concessions that have any meaning to anything. So it's important for those who are talking about their future to be together in conversation with one another. And I think if you move too quickly to let's find a win-win situation, that agreement on the street corner in North Belfast was a win-win situation. And it was going nowhere, precisely for the reasons that you talked about.
Jonah, there's another question in there from David Holloway.
Yes, there is. Carl, did you want to come in on that? There was something picked for you.
Well, if I could ask a quick question, maybe, I hope it's a quick question. Byron, we've talked a lot about negotiations and reaching agreements, and a lot of that sounds like it is between some leadership, some political leadership, some national leadership, state leadership, that sort of thing. Talk to me a little bit about where the responsibility for creating a shared future lies, because we live in a country where leadership is polarized. There will be no agreement at a national level on any number of issues. The space doesn't exist there right now. But at a local level, maybe it's possible. Maybe it's possible for mayors, for school boards, for the next level down, for shop owners, for neighbors, for teachers, police officers when they don't have their uniforms on. I mean, and when they do, for people. Talk to us a little bit where the responsibility lies to engage in this conversation we're talking about.
That's a very important question, Carl, and thank you for that. I think it has to do with how I think about the nature of peace. And so when I taught peace studies at Stanford, which I did for 25 years, there was one notion that peace got disrupted. If you moved the disruption, it went back to being peaceful. And I didn't believe that one bit. I believe that peace was created each day as people walked down the street and interacted with one another, as they went to their jobs, they worked. It was peace is created every day when you and I talk to one another, or when we engage with one another, and that's at the level which is the foundation. And in fact, the whole origins of Northern Ireland, of that humanity dialogue, was that we knew there was going to be an agreement because the two governments wanted there to be one. We didn't know whether it was 6 days in the future, 6 weeks, 6 months, or 60 years into the future. We didn't have any idea about that. But we knew eventually there would be one. But whenever one was reached, there weren't the relationships on the ground to sustain it. And that was key. And so I think that in many ways, having dialogue takes place in the corridors of power in Congress and all that. Yeah, that's fine. But the really important ones are what takes place in communities, where they create a sense of together of what they want, that we stand shoulder to shoulder moving forward. And that lays the foundations for whatever politicians do. Politicians will follow, hopefully, that will. There are plenty of ways to disrupt it. But if it's strong enough, they can't do it, and they will, they will get elected. We will elect the officials that we want to implement the future that we want in this country. That's a belief I have, and so I think that the key things for long term, it has to do with how all of us, even in this Zoom, talk to one another about the future we want to share.
It's really interesting. There's actually a question come in, Byron, from David Holloway from Community Dialogue in Northern Ireland.
I know David well.
I know that you know, which is lovely. It just is very timely. And he says, good to see you again, Byron. And then he says, do you think our Belfast Good Friday Agreement led to peace through separation and effectively copper fastened a form of sectarian power sharing government? If so, then what did we do wrong? And how can we move forward in a shared peace and representative participative democracy? So really asking about how we go back into those relationships again and how we manage those. I suppose that's quite connected to the last conversation with Carl.
Yeah. That thank you, David, I think, for that question. There sometimes we enter into arrangements or agreements that make possible future progress. That we have to accept things that then impede us moving forward to the goals that we want. I mean, there is some indication that certainly there that by putting in the kinds of proportional representation and consociationalism that the Good Friday Agreement was, it made movement toward just a normal politics impossible, because it solidified the base with each other. That what each side did was try to manage the conflict, because it solidified their bases, but keeping it from flaming up, and that was impossible to do. So I think you have to be careful. I don't think an agreement was possible without the kinds of power sharing arrangements that the Good Friday Agreement did. But then it becomes difficult to move forward, and you have to move from where you are. You can get beyond them if the people want to get beyond them. If they don't, then you'll stay locked into that kind of representational politics that in fact what we have in this, not dissimilar from what we have here in this country, that each side makes sure its base is solidified before it moves forward, and in doing so makes progress impossible. And
it may go some way towards your answer to Carl's question, which is that the deal was done in the end between politicians, not actually after long enough really working on the everyday elements of dialogue, and that at some level or other we handed over responsibility for that to the political class first as well.
Yeah, you have to have a ceasefire. I mean, that has to happen, and then the question is, what do you do with that area, that opportunity? But you can't stay there. I mean, it has to move forward. You know, we oftentimes, and this was mainly to Israelis when they were back in their unilateral stuff, and they didn't think an agreement with the Palestinians was possible, and so they're simply going to do the things they wanted to do unilaterally. And when we talk to them, we would say, make really sure you don't do things that make it impossible, make a future agreement impossible. And unfortunately, I think that they didn't heed that advice very well. But I think that we all have to look at when we're making an agreement of where are we in? I mean, have we just prevented any progress from taking place? And if so, how do we then deal with that situation? But there's no kind of magic bullets to that.
Okay, I think I'll pop in here, and I'm going to combine two questions. One's from William Zapp, and he asks, how do you overcome the inability to have a shared set of facts that one side doesn't accept what the other side is convinced is true? So that's part one, and it fits with Mariah Warner's. She says, Byron, you said earlier that the starting point for compromise needs to be taking everything off the table that is cruel and humiliating. But how can groups move forward when they don't seem to even agree on what cruel and humiliating constitutes? It seems like any attempt at compromise can get shut down before it even has a chance, just by the one side saying they find something cruel and or humiliating. All right. So even just those words themselves are problematic. So how do you respond to that?
I don't think we should even be at the table, whether it's a table of dialogue or a table of negotiation, unless we're going to try to get something that we can't do by ourselves. And so the sense that something is cruel and humiliating doesn't give me a ticket to leave the table. I can leave the table at any time, but also then leave on the table the possibility of anything that I want, the real things that I want to achieve. And so I'm drawn back to that kind of engagement, no matter what, if that's the case. I think people can misuse cruel and humiliating, but I think we all know what that means. I mean, I don't think that there's a disagreement about that. I don't think it's useful for me to tell you shouldn't be humiliated about that.
Right.
And so one of the reasons we didn't make humiliation, because the question of a humiliating peace, a non-humiliating, or how do we create a non-humiliating peace, is critical to whether a shared future is possible or not. And so but I don't think that telling you shouldn't be humiliated or you shouldn't think this is cruel is helpful about that. That's why in part we talk about loss and injustice. There are ways of beginning to look at that and approach that, and in ways that don't kind of involve my saying, "Well, I don't find it humiliating. Why should you?" And I guess I just don't think those are useful conversations. They're demeaning conversations to begin with. I mean, I shouldn't. When you're telling me you're humiliated, and I'm really believe that you're not pulling one on me about this, then I should listen to you.
Right. I think where I think there's some challenge is that in spaces that are run by majority, or where there's significant power differentials, to think that many people want to share when they don't have to. They don't have to. It doesn't benefit them to share. They lose a lot if they do. All right. I mean, that's a thinking. Now, it might be an illusion. It might not be true. But when people have a lot of power, why would they come to a table? Why would they compromise? They don't need to if voting is on their side. Where that compromise seems a little bit more reasonable is when there's not such strong differences in the numbers. But so that's one kind of reaction. But there are people that really kind of live in an illusion and a fantasy about the past and their people and their lives. And so it's really hard to kind of navigate through all of that, Byron, and to actually do this work.
I don't think any of it's easy. I mean that's just absolutely true. I would react a bit. I mean, in part, the description, there's a majority that doesn't need to take into account the minority. They'll just make their own decisions based on their own self-interest, is based on the kind of rational self-interest model of decision making. And I think that that's deficient. That people make decisions for all kinds of different reasons. And they make decisions every day that go against their immediate material self-interest, because that's the kind of people they want to be. And it involves taking into account the kinds of uncomfortable facts about our past. But I want to be a people. I want to be this kind of person. And that matters more in decision making than it does. When you're at a situation where a majority says, I don't care what the minority thinks about anything, we're going to do this, the sense of solidarity and commitment of political unity is already strained, if not broken. And the choice is then at this point, do you live together? Do you live separate? I mean, Northern Ireland had a certain kind of civil war. If we're going, and there is talk about whether we face one here or not, and I don't want to enter too much into that other than to say it'll be a very different kind of civil war here. And if I say to a substantial part of this population, you don't count. You say whatever you want to. It just doesn't make any difference. You don't count in any of this stuff. You are courting that kinds of division and civil war, which I think is really, really detrimental. That isn't who I want to be as a nation. But if it, if forced to that, then I can say, yeah, I want to separate. The best thing for us to do is separate. Now there's something Duncan talked about earlier that we had a big discussion with my partner Brian Lennon in Northern Ireland about, which is that conflict resolution does one of two things. It puts things together and says you sink and swim together, or it takes things apart. And many people think that taking things apart is easier. Taking things apart is harder than putting things together. And all you need to think of is a divorce. How difficult it is to separate what has been united and entwined in one another. And so I don't think those kinds of agreements of living, how do we part, are easy. They're difficult. They're more difficult than putting things together. And you have to, those are the choices we face. I mean, it isn't clear that you might want to say that there is a majority white population in the United States and a minority population in the United States, and that's the zero-sum kind of divide of this stuff. I think if you start, at least the hope is that if you were to push that the white majority would not side with the folks who want to maintain that kind of, because it isn't who they want to be. It's not how they think of themselves. Now that's a hope. It gets tested every day, but it's one that I still hope.
Can I ask into that, Byron, a little bit? I think that's a really interesting question. And I do wonder sometimes about, there's a question in from Colin Craig from Change Resistance, who's asking, can you build a radical centre ground and enough people who are interested in moving towards a shared future, knowing that you have to leave the fundamentalist edge behind? So instead of going in that polarization piece to look for that middle space, is that part of the possibility as well?
Those are always hard political calculations about this stuff. I mean, there's all this literature about if you can affect the outcome, you have to include them in the agreement. If they can't affect the outcome, then marginalize them. I don't know that any of that stuff is really helpful. I mean, I think it's hard political choices that have to be made about who gets included and who gets marginalized to this stuff. But they ultimately, I think as long as you're trying to keep that conversation going, then there is hope. The people who community dialogue wanted to get in their dialogue were those who really thought that reconciliation was a bad idea. They didn't really believe that the other side said the insane things they were reported as saying it, and they wanted to come to see if they'd say it to their face. And in the course of that interaction, they found some commonalities that that began to question those kind of previous assumptions. And it wasn't so much that I began to agree with the other side, as I began to respect where they came from. And that's the importance in building strong communities of encouraging respect. I don't have to agree with the conclusions that you bring, you draw from your experience, but I have to respect that's your lived experience. And that, if I'm willing to take that into account, there is at least some foundation for creating the common how do we live together question. And you know, you can't answer those questions in the abstract. You have to answer them in the very concrete thing of where are you in this stuff, and what can you come along with. And that happens in many ways. In what we're talking about with Carl, in how I walk down the street, who do I say hello to, who do I divert my eyes from, who do I walk around and try to avoid, how do I interact even those that make me uncomfortable. I mean, it involves all those kinds of really daily existential questions of how I live my life. And
this might be our final question. But part of my experience in this is dialogue is by its nature open-ended. That means there is no guarantee of success. This is not a success formula. This is a possibility, an opportunity. And I think one of the issues for me around the resolution issue is conflict is it suggests that the resolution is in the gift of the resolver rather than creating the context within which people who are actually in conflict come to some decisions about their own lives and make choices that they wish to make. So one thing is, first of all, part of me says one of the things I've really learned about this is dialogue doesn't have any guaranteed outcome. It has a possible outcome, and that's the start. The second one is that people like me who want to be involved in that kind of process do so from my own ethical position. I'm not standing outside this. This isn't a shop-bought formula. This is my contribution into a relationship in which I'm somehow involved. I'm starting from an ethical place, which is we have to find the space where our destinies are me and you rather than me or you. Partly because my personal humanity depends on that, my sense of personhood depends on that. So I suppose what I'm saying is, do we have to live with dialogue not as the white horse coming over the hill to resolve all our issues, but as a possibility which we can bring to the table under certain circumstances, and which we, or I, in this case, bring to the table because I think that's an important way in which we can begin to open up some of the really deep issues about injustice, about trust, about loss, and that actually almost in a more weak sense, unless we do something of this nature, then the possibility is that our choices are really limited to the zero-sum game. It's either me or you. So I suppose I just like your reflections a little bit on this is what it is. It's an opportunity. It's a possibility. It opens up things. It certainly has enabled us to see things which we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And it is in itself also a choice. It's something we have to decide whether we want to do. The option of not taking it is also there.
Two things, Duncan, that pop into mind. One is that, dialogue is not just simply an event that happens when I walk into a room where other people are there. Dialogue is a way of life. You're always in conversation with someone other. You're always, and it's about it taking that into realms that are previously have not been open to that. So that I think dialogue happens not just in rooms and formal settings, but it happens every day in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of interactions and in all kinds of discourses about that. The second one that I used to tell groups in Northern Ireland, it's not exactly on point to you, but it's something that I think is important. I had Davy Irvin come over and visit, and I can count him as my friend. I mean, Davy, we got to be close friends, close friends, good friends, over the course of my time in Northern Ireland. And I had him speaking to a group at Stanford. He was held in the Stanford Law School. And in the course of that, he was given a great speech. I mean, it was just marvelous. And I was enthralled by just listening to the guy. And somebody raised the hand and said, Mr. Irvine, would you tell us about your journey from a man of war to a man of peace? And he said, it wasn't like that at all. It wasn't like that at all. That there was a time, and it was, in his case, a Good Friday. It was his birthday, and it was 1972, and Belfast blew up at 5 o'clock from Republican bombs. And he said, I felt like I had to act. And so it wasn't that I was 100% for becoming Obama. In fact, I was very conflicted about it. It was 51-49 in favor of being Obama. But when I acted, I was 100% Obama. And in the course of my time in jail, I reflected on that and I did calculations. Things changed. I got different perspectives. And I did that calculation and it was 51-49, this time in favor of peace. And so when I acted, I was 100% peacemaker politician. How about that? We tend to think of it that I had to take you from here to here. And that's a gigantic difference. Where actually what I had to make was a small change in calculation that made all the difference in action about that. And so when you look at polarized situations and say, I can never get them to move from here to here, you may only need to make small changes in the way they see themselves and the calculations they make about their lives. And so I think that that's important as we look at what our gigantic projects of how do I move from these gigantic movements from here to there, and that sometimes it's really small changes and small calculations that have tremendous differences. And I've experienced that in my life. Carl entered I was pretty young, 8th grade or so when the Civil Rights Movement happened. It was a series of small changes that took me in the direction of where I am today. It wasn't one gigantic revelation. It is a continual process of small changes that give me greater insight of what it kind of means to live with wonderfully diverse and creative and innovative people.
Well, Byron, I want to thank you, and it's a wonderful thing that those small changes moved you in those directions and brought you to us.
I feel blessed for them.
First and foremost, I want to thank you for sharing with us what your view is of what a future might mean, a shared future, and how we get there. These same partners, these same people on the screen today, in Northern Ireland and the United States, began a conversation a short time ago with Martha Minow about facing the past to forge the future. And you furthered our understanding about the questions to ask, so we don't simply focus on a shared vision of the future, but instead think about creating a shared future. If we get a shared vision, that would be great too. Yeah. All's the better. Yeah. But a shared future is perhaps more likely for us. And we appreciate hearing and learning from your deep insights about the learnings from the lessons in the Middle East and in Northern Ireland, and of course here in the United States with the experience that you had through the last 60-ish years. During some very contentious times early in your life. And now we find ourselves in a new polarized and contentious time. You've taught us to ask the right questions and make building relationships a priority. And that opens the possibilities, as Duncan said, to new agreements, to new relationships, to new understandings of each other, to create peaceful relationships that make real the promise of a better shared future than the hostile peace some of us inhabit now. And I appreciated your talking about creating space locally that fosters dignity, safeguards livelihoods, and encourages respect across difference. You've given us tools that we can use to find the pathways to move forward to a brighter shared future. And for that, we are deeply grateful, not just for your learning, but for your sharing your heart with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No,
I just want to say, I want to thank all the people that have been on this chat. That we used to say in Northern Ireland, what do you do? People would ask us, what do you do? And they say, well, we talk to people, and if the conversation's helpful, we have a conversation tomorrow. Whenever they're not helpful, then in the case of Northern Ireland, we became drinking buddies or whatever. But as long as this is an important and interesting conversation, it is useful to all of us, and so that even coming to this is a blessing you give me, because it helps me to understand more, and I'll be my minister here. It helps me understand how more God lives in you.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful benediction for our time together here today. I want to thank the other people on the screen, Duncan Morrow, Terry Murphy, Shona Bell, and Chris Jelpia, who I guess is not on the screen with us, but is of course at the Mershon Center, for permitting me and my group to be part of this program. I want to thank our sponsors, Ulster University, Belfast, Northern Ireland, and the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland, and the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. My colleagues at the Divided Community Project, at the Moritz College of Law, all of which are housed on the Ohio State University campus. And it's been a privilege and a pleasure to work with this group, these friends now on the screen for the past year. So we've had the privilege and pleasure to learn from each other and to share important conversations on projects related to guiding truth and reconciliation style processes to advance racial equity in the United States, and on promising ideas for communities and university leaders on processes related to statues, names, contested spaces, and symbols. And we look forward to getting together again. It would be lovely to do so. I want to thank our audience today. If you enjoyed this program, please let us know and share it with others. It'll be available on YouTube shortly. And at the moment, we don't have the next conversation planned, but given the dynamic intellects represented on this screen and the hearts that are represented on this screen, I'm sure we'll find the time to get back together and to continue this conversation. And Byron, we hope you may be a part of that as well.
I will look forward to it.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful day and stay safe.
Thank you.